Today I'm going to be reviewing the Masterson Stay Wet Premier palette. It's 16 by 12 inches, retails for around $18 to $32. You can get it for $18 at Dick Blick Art, and you can get it for $32 on Amazon. Many of you probably already heard about or used the Masterson's wet palette. Now this is a great beginner wet palette or an advanced wet palette. However, if you're looking for something a bit larger, you sell the Premier wet palette, which you can see is more than twice the size of the Masterson's normal palette. The main differences between the regular and the Premier palette are the size and the height, as well as the different lid. This has a lid that just kind of pops open. This lid kind of peels open. It's a much different kind of lid, and it's a lot more secure, but it only goes on one way. So if you get this palette, you have to make sure that the Masterson's is reading right and you don't have it backwards. As you can see, the palette is just much larger. You're looking for something that's really big but not super expensive. For example, the Red Grass Games palette goes for around $50. It's actually smaller than this palette. It is lower profile. This palette's quite high profile. Here we take the lid off. It's about twice the height. However, it's more than twice the surface area. And it works just the same. It has a pretty similar sponge. The sponge is a little bit different. As you can see, my sponge didn't come kind of fitting the palette very well. I would have to reuse a razor blade and cut that edge off. I have a piece of copper in the corner on the palette to keep the bacteria down. I do keep a little piece of copper on the normal palette as well. However, I didn't have that same kind of copper wire, so I just used a little copper fitting. Now, the palette works basically exactly the same as the old palette. You can fill the sponge with water, use parchment paper as the paper, or you can use the artist paper that comes with the original palette on here. However, this palette did not come with paper, it just came with the palette and the sponge. So that's one difference. If you're using this for high body acrylics, might not be the palette for you, might be a little bit too big. The palette works much the same as the regular palette. You apply paint, and it'll keep the paint wet for days to come. Now, they recommend after you're done painting that you actually dry the sponge completely. However, if you live in a very moist climate, it might be difficult to actually dry the sponge, especially if it's raining. It'll start to dry when the edges of the sponge curl up, and you'll notice that all the moisture is being sucked out. And after that, you can just leave it dry, and the next time you're ready to use it, just wet the sponge and it will fit back like it used to. This will cut down on bacteria like mold as well, but I also have a piece of copper to do that. But look how small of a surface area that paint takes up. You look over here, when you're trying to do things like blend different colors or just wet your paint out without having to put water in it, just by doing something like this. If you like to thin your paint by just swirling it around the wet palette and then getting it to the right consistency, that's something that takes a lot of space on your palette. Look how much space that's taking versus something like this. You want to do that on here. Take the paint and so you can thin the paint down to a nice consistency, even a glazed consistency. And look how much of the space I have left. This palette's great for doing blends or mixing your own colors. For example, if I want to make a nice bright or dark gray, see, I can just easily mix can have a nice gradient, and you still have plenty of room to do more than just black, white, and gray. You want to do this with blue, yellow, red, whatever color you want to do with, you have plenty of working space. So look how much space that took up versus if I did that over here. Say I want to make this tan color kind of a dead looking gray. Darken that up a bit. Look how much more space that takes up on this palette versus on this palette. You'll have 16 by 12 inch working space, which is just a very large working space, and it's actually larger than the extra large Redgrass games. The smaller palette is 8.5 by 7 inches. This palette is 12 by 16 inches. They actually have an in-between size as well that's 8 by 12 inches. So if this palette is just too big, but this palette is too small for you, they do have an in-between size. Now this particular palette comes with a red lid right here. However, they do sell the exact same palette with a blue lid. And the medium palette has a yellow or orange lid. You can get the larger palette for $18 on blickart.com or $32 on Amazon. The blue lid version is around $23, and I'm not really sure what the difference is between the blue and the red. They seem to be the same size and use the same sponge. The only difference I can find is that they have a different color lid. Now this palette retails for around $15 to $17, and the medium sized palette retails for around $20. So if you want to get a new palette, but you're just thinking that this palette is too small for you, and you don't want to spend $50 to get the Redgrass Games extra large, this is a great buy. It does have a very high profile, which might not be for you. If you really like the low profile, then perhaps you want to go with the Redgrass Games. However, it is more than twice the price, so I don't really think that it's worth the extra money. Again, this is $18, and that Redgrass Games one is around $50. So it's a lot more expensive. It's almost 3 times the price for a smaller palette. Perhaps the sponge is superior on the Redgrass Games, but this sponge is very good and it lasts a long time. And if you care for it properly, you won't get a lot of mold.